Sri Sanjeev Pandey ji, CA Avil Menezes, and Sapan Gupta. And we will be discussing on the pre-packs and the issues that are there we face in the liquidation. Before the start of the session, and before I introduce, this event is jointly done by IMC, Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and IP Foundation. IP Foundation is a trust that has been formed for the sharing of knowledge on the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which has 17 chapters. We come out with a monthly newsletters. We have regularly conduct IP clinics, and we have come out with a reference guidebook and a judgment book in the past. And we also make a regular representation to the regulator. So the participants who would like to join the IP Foundation will be shared with the link where they can just register themselves and take part in the IP Foundation activity. Sanjeev Pandey ji, I will first introduce Sanjeev Pandey ji. Sanjeev Pandey ji is a head of NCLT division at a stress asset resolution group of State Bank of India. He started his career with the State Bank of India as a probationary officer in 1986, and during his 34 years with SBI has worked on different assignments in commercial banking, project finance, stress asset management, restructuring and rehabilitation of weak and sick units. Mr. Pandey has handled restructuring of distressed loan under BFR, CDR, and other schemes. He had also carried out international banking exposure as a head of treasury and investment at SBI Singapore from 2009 to 2014. He was also on deputation at IBBI, where he was associated with drafting of IBBI regulation. He was a coordinator for working group of CRP, fast track, IRP, voluntary liquidation. He has been also a part of working group on a personal insolvency, cross-border and group insolvency. Currently, as a head of NCLT, he is responsible for initiation of and monitoring more than 900 CRP and liquidation. His role includes drafting of banks, IBC policy, SOPs and guidelines, and provides expert opinion in IBC matters, empanelment and monitoring of insolvency professional and insolvency lawyers, and training bank officials in IBC. Mr. Pandey has also authored the official training manual on resolution of stress asset of SBI for the officer involved in management of stress asset. With this short introduction of Sanjeev Pandey, sir, basically, as most of the IPs would be knowing, sir, as he is one of the person who has been regularly sharing his knowledge on the subject. And today also, we were fortunate enough to get his appointment and to get a knowledge share from him on the topic of pre-pack, which is the discussion paper that has been issued. And also we will discuss with the point on liquidation. So with this, I request Sanjeev Pandey ji to share his thoughts first on the pre-pack and to start the discussion. Sanjeev ji.
Thank you, Sanil ji.
Yes, sir.
I think you could have introduced all of the panel first, then maybe we can proceed. Or you want me to?
Sir, it becomes good once you read the introduction and then the speaker speaks instead of having all the three speakers doing it. I thought to change little position of these things. Yes, sir.
Okay. No problem. So pre-pack, I think it is a very well-established concept in the US and UK regimes, insolvency regimes. If you see the US Chapter 11 insolvencies, there basically when the company files for Chapter 11, they have to come back with a prepared plan. Or sometimes they are given time, but basically it is debtor in control and the plan is submitted by the CD only. It is something similar to our proposed pre-pack. Even in UK also, it is a very well established scheme. Almost 1/3 of the insolvency resolutions in US and UK are achieved through pre-pack. So it is something which is well prevalent in these markets, developed markets. I think in India, what we see from the paper circulated by the MCA and IBBI, it is slightly different from the regime which is already established in UK. Basically, the UK and US regimes, or rather UK regime, it talks about a pre-arranged change of management. Like the management comes forward to the financial creditors with a proposal for sale of entire assets or sale of the company, the management of the company to another party. And the banks have to put a seal on that. And then when the banks agree, they go to the court for putting a seal on the arrangement. In India, what we are seeing is basically what I perceive that the scheme provides for resolution or restructuring with the existing promoters. That is what I guess it is trying to propose. And then, of course, there will be a Swiss challenge later on. But basically, what we are seeing in Indian scheme is that the proposal is to negotiate the resolution plan with the existing promoters. That is the one difference I saw with the foreign regimes. Yeah, it has various advantages. One is it is a kind of I think amicable arrangement. Like the CIRP also started as an amicable arrangement, but because of Section 29A, it became a kind of adversarial regime. So even though even today we call it as a non-adversarial scheme, but because of Section 29A, it is perceived as an adversarial scheme, and that is why there is a lot of litigation from the time of admission to the resolution and all. Here, I think because the proposal is to provide a chance or opportunity to the promoters to submit a plan, and when that plan goes to NCLT, since there will not be any challenges, because promoters, the bankers or FCs will be already on board. So I expect the NCLTs will take less time for admitting these cases. As of now, what NCLTs are doing is minimum time taken for any admission is 3 months, and it has gone for up to maybe 2 years. We have cases pending in NCLT for admission for up to 2 years. There may be some litigation involved, but that is something we expect that NCLT will take care. And because the proposal for initiation is coming from the CD itself, I feel that the timelines will be achieved, which is very, very critical for this. Second basic problem here I see in this, of course, the positive is that value preservation. One of the basic flaw of any insolvency regime, including CIRP regime, is that the moment there is a public announcement of the insolvency of a corporate debtor, there is a bad perception in the market, there is a loss of credit, loss of credibility, and that results in a substantial erosion of value of the enterprise. And I think most of the RPs and the professionals and who are dealing with these cases, they must be appreciated. Just by the incidence of a public announcement makes a considerable dent on the value of the CD. Here, because this process will be kind of confidential till the time it approaches the court, so that value will be preserved. That is one. And then there will be second positive is that when we go for a CIRP, the basic flaw is that we are getting into a dark alley where we don't know whether it will lead to a outlet or it will lead to a black hole. Here, at least we have one resolution plan in hand. Like we have experienced in the case of CRPs, only 1 out of 5 cases is leading to a resolution. 4 out of 5, 80% of the cases are landing into liquidation. And then that is a substantial erosion of value. Here, that value can be preserved because one, we have a base plan available when we go to NCLT. We have a base plan available. and some kind of unanimity or maybe positive approach of the lenders, they are amenable to the plan. That's why it is reaching the stage of NCLT. So that is, I think, another positive about this, that we will see much more value here. At the same time, there are certain negatives also. Negatives I can see, of course, other positive I can jot out, like one is speed. Of course, the basic paper says that it has to be, the trigger has to be the default. I don't see why for a pre-pack default should be a trigger. But I think it is the constraint posed by the Indian law, Indian code, that the trigger has been kept as a default of 1 crore. I think here the paper proposes default of something between or from 1 lakh to 1 crore. But my view is that the process of a pre-packaged plan starts much before default, and then only it can be a fruitful and a viable plan. But I don't see it much of a problem, because if the bank sees the early warning signals early and the promoters are confident enough to approach the bank at an early stage of insolvency before there is a default, and they prepare a plan, then they have ample time to develop a plan. And default, as we all know, is not a big thing to achieve. One single non-payment of an interest or installment can lead to a default, and ultimately the proposal can be filed with NCLT. So I feel that although law says that the trigger will be default, but in practice, better way would be to start the process early from the initial signs of stress, prepare a plan, get it approved, get it kind of consented by the creditors, financial creditor, and then maybe trigger a default. And then on that basis, file with NCLT. So this problem can be taken care of. Another positive will be like there will be preservation of jobs, because as we have seen that in case of resolution as well as liquidations, considerable amount of jobs are lost. Here, as is the experience in the Western regimes also, most of the jobs are preserved in a pre-pack insolvency. So that is another positive here. Then the cost advantage. In case of CIRP, we know that time and costs are tremendous. We don't have control over time and we don't have control over costs. But here, because the RP's role is very, very limited, so we expect that the fees of RP will also be low compared to a CIRP fees, as well as other CIRP expenses. And since the debtors are in control, they will be bearing that cost. So again, that will not be a cost to the creditors. Then ultimately, it is the maximization of value, which is important in any insolvency regime. Here, my view is that it will fetch a better price than at least many resolution plans or liquidations, which we are achieving through the IBC. Only some top 50 or 100 plans have got some good value. Otherwise, we see the valuation received for smaller company, SMEs and all, it is not more than maybe 20%. So here, I feel that it will be something like 40 to 50%, which is being achieved under the CIRP. That kind of value minimum should be achieved. And only when the financial creditors are able to achieve that value, then only this scheme will be able to go forward. Otherwise, nobody will entertain this kind of proposals. These are some of the views I have on this. Of course, there are certain suggestions, like one is Section 12A. I don't see why the Section 12A should be applied as it is in case of pre-pack. Then we will be limiting the application of this very good proposed scheme to very limited number of CDs. I think the rigor of 12 months NPA should be relaxed. Other than that, all other 29A ineligibility should stay in place. But the rigor of any NPA account more than 12 months not eligible under Section 29A, that goes against this basic scheme of pre-pack. So I think that should be relaxed. That is my view on that. Then the timeline. 90-day timelines are tight. So my view is that some kind of extension may also be provided. As in this CRP, we have a extension of another 90 days. I think 45 days extension should be permitted through the application to NCLT. So that will help in bringing more interest from the Swiss challenge method, because every due diligence of a company takes time. If somebody is interested and within 90 days he has to complete the due diligence, I think it's a challenge. So some kind of extension may be help this. And of course, the limitations are the lack of transparency, price discovery. One major flaw I see in this scheme is that the operational creditors will be getting the entire value. This goes against the basic fundamental of any insolvency law, because the unsecured creditors cannot be benefited or cannot get a value better than secured creditors or secured financial creditors. So my view is that even if the secured creditors are taking a haircut, we can, the government or the IBBI can prescribe the minimum haircut should be, maximum haircut should be equal to the haircut suffered by the financial creditor. But financial creditor being secured, better placed, should not suffer loss at the cost of the operational creditors. So that is something I'm not in favor of. So I think the authorities will look into that. That is my suggestion. And then one more important aspect is the role of RP here. Because RP will be, of course, coming from the CD's choice. So he will be, and he will get paid also from the CD's pockets. So there's some kind of conflict of interest here. So I would like to see how the RP plays out in this scheme. So if they are too much inclined towards the promoters, then some kind of malfeasance and fraud can happen. So role of RP is very, very important. And I think some powers should be given to the COC to have a choice of RP, even if somebody else is appointed or nominated by the CD, or even a change of RP, some provision should be there. These are my views. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving us an overview and views on the pre-pack. I would like to invite the other speaker, CA Avil Menezes. Avil Menezes is a fellow chartered accountant and has done his master's in commerce from the University of Mumbai, and he is a registered insolvency professional. He is also a founder promoter of Aegis Resolution Services Private Limited, IPE, registered with IBBI. He has more than 16 years of experience in finance and banking sector and has worked with ICICI Bank for 8 years in SME and mid-corporate banking vertical. He specializes in fund raising, debt structuring, financial advisory, and insolvency resolution services. He has a good exposure on various debt restructuring schemes notified by RBI for stress asset companies and resolution and liquidation process under Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. He is one of the earliest insolvency professionals registered with Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, and he is currently handling large assignment as a resolution professional and as a liquidator. Most of the RPs basically would be well versed aware of it. Avil, I would like you to take the discussion ahead on your views on pre-pack before we move to our third speaker. Yes, Avil.
Yeah, thank you, Snehal Bhai, and thank you, IP Foundation, along with IMC for hosting this event. And I think my predecessor, Sanjeev Ji, I mean, a veteran as far as IBC is concerned. He's laid the ground rules and the basic framework as far as pre-pack is concerned. So I'll just add to what Sanjeev sir has said. So I think most of the participants here are insolvency professionals who would be handling accounts. As far as the last 4 years since IBC has come into place, I think all the stakeholders are well versed with the entire flow of IBC. Sufficient jurisprudence has evolved. The law has settled. Government and regulators have been proactively looking at ways to augment and I would say to supplement the efforts which have been placed by the insolvency professionals, by the market participants, the committee of creditors. So a lot of regulatory changes, changes in the code, changes in the regulations have gone through. However, I mean, as far as experience is concerned, if you ask people about their experience in IBC, of course, different stakeholders will have a different experience. But everyone did think the need that there has to be another mechanism which would provide a shorter time limit, less litigation, and probably a quicker resolution. So initially the court did mandate 180 days. A lot of litigation did happen. Of course, most of the cases which were resolved or either moved to liquidation went through the entire rigmarole of the 180 plus 90 to 70 days. Then litigation was also excluded. So 270 was never achieved in most of the cases, as all are aware. So given the background, I think in the last 4 years, a lot of water has flown, and now I think it is the right time for the proposed package of pre-packs, which obviously the market participants were pushing for a lot of time. A lot of foreign players were sitting on the fences, and they were probably looking at a much more simpler insolvency regime as it is there in the countries abroad. So one of the most important aspect was to reduce the time. So pre-pack gives you that. So the code has actually redefined the balance of power amongst all the stakeholders of the company in terms of their own rights and interests. Fairly, I think by now, being the creditor in control regime to a large extent has, I would say, established a fair dealing between the debtors and the creditors, which were not there earlier. Earlier, I mean, as a creditor, I was always dependent on the debtor to pay me. Now I have a very quick and efficient regime in terms of a CIRP, where the promoter loses the control, and of course, no promoter would want to lose control. So what IBC has done is established a fair debtor and creditor relationship. Of course, what we used to earlier call the defaulters paradise has been lost, and today most of the corporate debtors are looking at a mechanism to resolve the stress earlier. Even after initiation of CIRP, there are provisions of withdrawal before the COC is formed as a mechanism of 12A. And even before COC, the case gets admitted to CIRP, of course, you can withdraw by settling with the creditor. So there were a lot of schemes which are also there other than IBC, which can be used by the lenders in terms of various RBI schemes. The company themselves or any of the creditors can look at the scheme of compromise and settlement under the aegis of the Companies Act 2016. So pre-pack, the way it has been now packaged, and probably what we are seeing as a part of the recommendations of the committee, it is supposed to be a fast, cost-efficient, and effective way of resolution of stress. Of course, the main basic features of the structure of the code has been preserved. So obviously, there is a resolution professional who's going to oversee the process. There is a committee of creditors where certain decisions, of course, it is a debtor in possession. So that's a variance with what the code did have. So of course, changes to the code are anticipated by way of either a law or an ordinance. But yes, the basic structure of the code has been preserved so as to ensure that there is a quick resolution. The resolution is also cost effective because under a CIRP, if the case drags on, of course, there is a reputation risk for the CD. It is difficult also for the insolvency professionals along with the COC to keep it running for a sufficiently long period of time. Of course, as time goes on, the value of the asset also erodes. And finally, what comes to the COC or to the stakeholders is values which are very close to the liquidation value. So that's where I think the confidence of the stakeholders needs to be boosted. So this is another mechanism of pre-pack which allows a corporate debtor to initiate a insolvency resolution process. Earlier, a lot of Section 10 applications were filed with the introduction of 29A. All that did stop because one key aspect of 29A was NPA more than 12 months at a time of submission of a resolution plan. So that was a deterrent. But with the pre-pack coming in, the debtor in possession being there, so it is an incentive for a management to retain control. Of course, there is an informal process which would precede a formal initiation of a CIRP under a pre-pack framework, wherein the corporate debtor or its management will have to really look at a base plan. So the idea is that you do not shoot in the dark. As in a CIRP, any creditor takes you and probably you start a process for investor search. Here, there is an incentive for a promoter to start early. As soon as he sees the signs of stress and default, of course, the recommendation of the committee is that we are only going to look at default, because the pre-pack is more structured or tuned in terms of the code, which recognizes the default of even a single day. So that's what would help a quicker resolution, because the promoter does have a chance of getting back his own company. So there is a base plan. Of course, once the base plan comes in for value maximization, there is also a mechanism which has been evolved, which possibly is in the nature of a Swiss challenge, a Swiss auction. What it says is, if there is a base plan, you would obviously rate the base plan and you would come out with a score, a weighted average score. If any interested investor comes in, of course, he will have to match or better the plan by an X percentage. So that is a percentage which can be decided by the COC at that point in time. If someone outbid by that percentage, of course, the process comes to an end and the resolution applicant takes over the management of the company. So it is also a disincentive for the promoter to bid for a sufficiently low price. So what we are seeing right now in terms of recoveries would be 10%, 30%, 40%. Probably, as Sanjeev sir rightly put out, if you would look at from a pre-pack mechanism, any recovery more than 50%, of course, that is something which would bring more energy into the entire system. So the Swiss challenge also has those safeguards by which the promoter as well as the interested RA both will have an equal chance of outbidding each other. Say, for instance, if the threshold is 15% more than what the promoter has given, and if someone has to bid for more than that, fair enough, the other person gets and the promoter does not get to match. But if he only increases by 5%, then the promoter will have a chance. And this process, although it has been if it is defined in the code, will also reduce a lot of litigation as far as this process is concerned. So another recommendation would be that this process should be to a large extent simplified and made a part of either the regulations or the code. So that would help reduce litigations, at least on the value maximization part. So this is something which would ensure that the company looks to revive in the shortest possible time. Of course, with the informal process, there comes a formal process of 90 days within which the entire process will have to be concluded. And the recommendation also says that the adjudicating authority should not take more than 45 days to pass a resolution plan, because most of it in terms of litigation or in terms of value maximization or the binding nature of a plan would have already incorporated before the initiation of CIRP. As far as control of the process is concerned, the creditors do have control, and that is a welcome point. So all approvals which are required as per Section 28 will need to be taken. Of course, there is also a caveat in case the promoters who are eligible as per 29A do not want a Swiss auction. They can give a price where all the OCs are covered to 100%. So if there is no impairment as far as the operational creditors, including employees and statutory authorities, are concerned, then the financial creditors are free to take a call whether they would want to take a haircut or whether they want to do a value maximization where a plan of a competing bidder can be done. This mechanism would also help in building the confidence of the stakeholders, because there would be no disruption in the businesses, because none of them in a normal CIRP would like to provide any credit to the RP because the outcome of the process is not certain. So the experience of the overseas market says that in most of the pre-pack, the likely conversion ratio is high. So that's where the confidence of the stakeholders would be maintained in the process. And of course, for the adjudicating authority, it would be quite simpler to look at it. In terms of key pillars of the process, of course, there has to be a promoter and the availability of a base plan. Otherwise, the plan just cannot take off. Even before it goes to the NCLT, the approval of the shareholders by simple majority and the unrelated financial creditors will have to be taken. Although the RP would be identified by the promoter or the corporate debtor, however, the FCs will also have to agree to it, or the FCs can change it prior to initiation of the process. So there is a check and mechanism that the RP who is proposed, of course, will also be validated and can also be recommended by the financial creditor. Otherwise, the financial creditors are not going to approve the initiation of a pre-pack process. The threshold for the financial creditor is 51% because the idea of keeping it low is so that as the process matures, 66% can be achieved. So 51% is a welcome threshold as far as initiation of this is concerned. The RP has a very limited role. Of course, the RPs are saddled with compliances today in a normal CRP running the process. Too many issues, non-cooperation, protecting and preserving the value of the asset. Here, since the debtor is in possession, the RP only has to manage the process. However, any services which are obtained during this period, there is a moratorium, but the moratorium will not, the moratorium is not applicable to critical services because the debtor is in possession. However, saying so that any insolvency resolution process for running the company, which was today automatically as a part of the insolvency resolution cost, in this particular framework is not protected. So clarity will need to emerge. Otherwise, it would be difficult to maintain the going status. What is protected in the by way of the recommendation is the interim finance. Subject to approval of the COC, the RP fees, the process cost has been protected. But what has not been protected is essentially the goods and services which are utilized by the corporate debtor during this period. If at all any CIRP cost which are recognized by the code or the regulations remains unpaid, there is no clarity right now. Of course, the regulations as and when they come will have clarity as far as this is concerned. So essentially, I mean, the key thing rests on the promoter. As Sanjeev ji also pointed out, and there was I would say a difference of opinion amongst the committee members, because if the CD has to initiate the plan and you have a 29A, especially in terms of 29A1C, which says an NPA not greater than 24 to 12 months, not many promoters would want to come. Even another issue in this is, I mean, if you compare this with an OTS, as far as the lenders is concerned, the lenders will have to pre-accord their approval by 51%. So in many cases, the lenders might take a lot of time. They would insist on a forensic audit and so on and so forth. So there would be a race of time for many companies who would be on the borderline as far as 29A is concerned. So I think one thing which should be looked at is relaxation little bit in terms of 29A. Of course, during the process, at any point of time, the COC can close the process or can pass a resolution for liquidation of the corporate debtor. The threshold has been kept high in terms of 75%. Otherwise, everywhere else, the threshold is 66% present and voting. So these are my few initial thoughts. I think we have another speaker also lined up. So with this, I hand it over to Snehal Bhai.
Thank you, Avil, to throw a light on the subject. We have our third panelist, Mr. Sapan Gupta. Sapan is currently working as a vice president in ArcelorMittal Group and is heading legal, compliance and secretarial function of ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel JV in India. He was a partner in Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas and national head of banking and finance practice at the firm. Sapan has a considerable experience on the matter relating to general commercial lending, cash management, transaction banking, leverage finance, mergers and acquisition, private equity, debt capital market, debt restructuring, directive portfolio management, securitization, external commercial borrowing, and loan syndication. Sapan has also handled various transactions pertaining to private and public issuance of bond and has advised several foreign currency convertible bond transactions. Sapan has also worked in past as a chief legal officer for Bajaj Finance, one of the largest non-NBFC in the country, with a asset under management of 6 billion USD. Prior to the current assignment, Sapan was the head of legal corporate finance, transaction banking and capital market, South Asia Standard Chartered Bank. He had previously worked with Tata Group, ICICI Bank, HSBC Bank at various positions, and has gained international experience and learned synergetic practices when he had worked with a leading US firm, Sidley Austin LLP in New York, in its New York office. He has the honor to serve as a chairman of a Mumbai chapter of Young Indian at a Confederation of Indian Industry, and has also served as a member of a Legal and Operation Committee of Indian Banking Association. At Harvard Law, he was an international editor of Records newspaper. He's a commerce graduate and a LLB from University of Delhi. Received a LLM degree at Harvard Law, and where he was a Tata scholar. He has attended London School of Economics as a Shiving Gurukul scholar in 2013, and he is qualified to practice law in India and New York. And he has been ranked as a leading lawyer by various publications, including Chambers, IFLR 100, and Asian Law 500. With this short introduction of Sapan, I would like Sapan to share his thought before we go for the moderation round on the question Q&A things. Sapan.
Thank you, Snehal. And I think the introduction needs revising. It wasn't short in any form. I think that's the next thing I'll do after this. And Bajaj Finance market cap is now, I think, some 25, 30 billion probably. Anyways, thank you so much. And thank you for finding out time to listen to us. Mr. Pandey and Avil covered about the whole proposal which IBBI has come up with. And then I'm sure you would have also gone through it in your own time. One is that this is fairly well written document. It really covers the various jurisdiction. It has beautiful charts. It's a very easy read in that sense. And the co-participants the co-speakers have explained to you in the detail. So I would just spend 5 to 7 minutes on where I see a little more deliberation is required rather than getting into what's written on the piece of paper, because I am assuming that some of you would be sending comments on this before the black letter law is written. I think we would really start from the perspective is that where this pre-pack discussion came from. I think this discussion was even part of the BLRC when IBC was being written that should there be a structure in India which allows pre-pack. For some reason, it was not included in the original act and also in the following 4 ordinance amendments. Maybe one of the reasons was that the country or the market was not ready for bankruptcy and you have to do things in steps. It took a fair bit of time, close to 4 years, slightly more than 4 years for this to come out. But better late than never. So generally it's a good step because it gives parties to come with a solution in a much faster way than the bankruptcy itself. But the question which it raises is, if you look at the report, it treats this process as something like which is different to CIRP. It has one column for CIRP and the other column for pre-pack. To my mind, it's a CIRP. It's one form of CIRP, which we are saying that before you go to the court and obtain an order, there will be a CIRP which will be run. It could be called a pre-CIRP. It could be called a pre-packed CIRP. So I think it would be better that the process is taken as an additional step and as not as a new process, because you will be using the judgments, the judicial precedents, and the interpretation which have been used in the past. So it would be of immense help that it is not really distinguished as a completely new or novel process. Then comes the 29A test. Very interesting. Both the speakers mentioned about it. Only part in the report which documents that there was a difference in opinion. Now, how do you look at 29A? 29A is, are we saying that the 29AC, which is the most important provision about 1 year in default after NPA has been called? So are we saying that if some promoter is in default and it's only 6 months and 29AC is not triggered, so he can participate in the pre-packs? Or are we saying that the other parts of the 29A, which are quite exhaustive and extensive and does not relate only to the company, it relates to guarantee, it relates to connected person, what happens to that part? So would it help that if there is a distinction which is made between 29AC and the other parts of 29A? And on C, it is clarified that are we saying that it needs to be followed only if 1 year has passed? The importance of that is that the promoter will have an incentive to get into pre-pack if it is before 1 year. You can come and say, look, before it gets triggered, let's work out a solution because I can also participate in the process. And that could be a good way out of the disagreement among the committee members to say that, okay, he gets additional 12 months to solve his problem if he is a genuine promoter and the loss is because of business cycles and not of any misuse of the bank's fund. So I think 29A should be probably looked in more detail and see that how it would work. And it would also face another challenge, that post-COVID scenario, IBC generally also have not been able to attract too many foreign investors. Is it time that some leverage is given on 29A? Then the second part is this whole Swiss challenge, WAS. Swiss challenge has been used by the government in many auctions in the past. It's a well-established principle which has been approved by Supreme Court in various bidding. But the moot and the primary question is that is it for the regulator to get into the bidding mechanism? In the CIRP, they never got into it. H1, motivated by IBA and among sort of unwritten agreement among the banks, came the concept that we will go with the highest bidder, also the CBC guidelines. An H1 concept came, which was primarily followed in a handful of cases. An open bidding was followed. In one of the recent controversial cases, the COC decided to go for a bid again. So we had different forms of bidding and processes, and H1 was probably the most followed and was the least controversial and was upheld in various courts. But all of this was not recommended by the court or the IBBI. It left the discretion to the COC to decide. So why, and then that's the concept which overall the regulators in India have followed, be it RBI, be it SEBI, that you leave it to the market to decide the best mode of recovery or the best mode of highest value creation. It is not for the regulator. The purpose of the regulator is to ensure transparency in the process, integrity in the process, but not to actually run the process. RBI doesn't decide interest rates. It says that how do you arrive at interest rate is important, not what the interest rate is. So from that perspective, I think it's probably going a step ahead and then getting into the economics of the transaction. Probably not for the regulator to get into, in my view. 90 days sounds nice, happy. 270 became 330. Then the code was amended to say 330 includes court time spent in court. No court took it seriously. The cases go on beyond 270, 330, 800 days, 900 days, 1000 days. It looks good. It looks good on paper. but I doubt that this will get really implemented, because you are saying financial creditors come in, majority starts unrelated FCs is what they have used. Now, we have still not settled that whether FCs include CCPS holders, whether FCs include the bond holder, RBI regulated or not regulated. So there are various issues which are open around the definition of FC itself. So you say unrelated FC, there will be people who say, no, this majority is not sufficient, because if you count us, 51% doesn't really works. Then RP has a very limited power. So yeah, so 90 days, the role of the court is again going to be very important. We will spend serious amount of time in courts, and 90 days will become difficult. It's good to have as a guideline, but doubtful it will lead to any improvement. Now comes the role of RP. You said you need an RP for what? Basically, you are saying for transparency. So he's basically the guy with the hammer. Sit down, read the rule. I will say 1, 2, 3. Go for Swiss challenge. Financial creditor, go and liquidate the balance sheet. Who is running the company? Debtor in possession. Who is going to get the value? COC. How will you derive at the value? Go to WAS. Claims. No method prescribed. So what is RP doing? In the RP's role, you have basically made him an auctioneer to just stand there and say, look, I'm holding the hammer. I'll say when to get up, when to get out, when to get in. But it doesn't really give any good powers or any solid powers to RP. And unfortunately, RP's role in CIRP took a lot of time to be derived, whether he's responsible for checking the feasibility and viability, whether he's responsible to certify 31, whether he's responsible for the claims, whether he's responsible for 29A. A lot of this got settled in the form that most of these issues fall with COC. RP has to enable. Now, this again will lead to a lot of litigation, that what is the definition of the role of RP. And IBBI, I think, and the committee owes it to the RP as a regulated professional to be very clear and specific that what is required out of RP, rather than again leave them to be derived and then getting into issues later with notices and complaints going against them. I think that's 1 lakh and 1 crore is another issue. I think, yes, COVID is on the mind of all of us. 3 months extension is there. But I think we should not be making long-term decisions based on COVID. If the government feels that there is a need for any moratorium or changes due to COVID or any other force majeure, we should leave it to that, rather than defining our law specifically that, okay, we do 1 lakh and 1 crore subject to COVID. I think it just creates confusion. Let's keep it plain and simple. What is the law? If there is COVID, it comes up. Okay. Yeah, and then one more last point is that the debt should be as per the information utility. The books of the debtor is not good enough, and RP is not there to check, so it should be matched by the information utility. So I think these are some high-level comments on the proposal which is there. I'll hand it over back to Snehal for taking it forward.
Thank you, Sapan, for taking us through again on the pre-pack and giving your views on the various things. Okay, today what we propose now is basically we start with the Q&A, basically, where I will push a question to each of you panelists, and you can share your views on that on pre-pack, and thereafter we will take a liquidation Q&A where we can have a discussion on it. And any of the participant who is also looking for some questions on that can put it on chat box, and we will take that with our panelists. If you have a direct question for any panelist, put clearly on the chat box that this question relates to so and so panelist. So accordingly we can take. So a quick understanding on the things that what we understood from you three of the panelists. If I have to summarize in the 2 minutes, is basically it's a pre and before the CRP the process starts as which is a pre-pack process that we understand, and the objective is also to the similar to what we have in CRP to resolve the initiation process. There may be difference of default of in CRP, like it's the default above 1 crore and excluding COVID, whereas here in it may be pre and post default stress, including COVID default in phase manner if it can come. So there are various points that I have, which I would like to push across to you in the said things. Like as we said that Sanjeev ji, about OTS schemes that we have and this pre-pack. Now, what do you have in your mind? Like, what is the difference that is there between OTS and pre-packs from the lender perspective? Sanjeev ji, can you throw a light on the point?
You're on mute.
Sanjeev ji?
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I see two ways it is better than a OTS. One is that OTS is a kind of lopsided where there is not much transparency. The value is not exactly known. Valuation are not very transparent. So, and the bankers or the financial creditor, whoever enters into OTS, he also has a slight concern in the mind that this can be opened by some agencies. So that is another concern. Whenever we enter into OTS, that some agency may come after you against any complaint and they start investigating. So that is one comfort provided by this process where the court puts a stamp on the proposal, on the plan, this plan. One, and secondly, some price discovery is also there, because if we go for a Swiss challenge, so there'll be some kind of price discovery which is not there in a OTS. As we know, OTS are generally based on reserve price, and reserve price is fixed by some valuation which may be 1 year old. But since the market is dynamic, so unless you have a market-oriented price discovery, so people can take advantage of the full valuation. That is my view. The two advantages against OTS.
Right. Avil, a quick question to you on the same point, OTS and pre-pack difference from the borrower's perspective. Avil?
Yeah, thank you. So from borrower's perspective, I mean, as long as I'm eligible under 29A to submit a resolution plan, I should always opt for a pre-pack. However, saying that, I mean, it's very difficult for me to convince the lenders for admission of this particular pre-pack scheme, because unless the threshold is matched, what the lenders are looking at, then it's very difficult. So I think more than the borrowers, it is for the lenders to look at a market-oriented price discovery in a pre-pack scenario, which would be much easier and would be much palatable as a process. So it's more process-driven rather than having bilateral negotiations. One or two lenders, I think OTS can be done. But if there are many lenders, it's always better to get into a mechanism of a pre-pack as long as I'm a borrower who's eligible under Section 29A. One, it also gives me the stamp of an adjudicating authority. So that also helps the lenders. At the same time, if there is some stress, which obviously a haircut can be passed on to the operational creditors, unlike in an OTS. So I think that would also help me balance the interest of all the stakeholders. In an OTS, the haircut only accrues to the financial creditor. So I think that mismatch, as a borrower, I will be able to balance it to everyone and not only pass it to one set of creditors.
Right. A quick question to Sapan. On Sapan, how do you look at the creditors controlling this pre-pack process and interfering with the CD during this pre-pack? So creditors, I mean, holistically, both financial, operational, whatever, as of this process, how do you, because the CD is in control of the running the unit and RP is in only to run the process. So during this period of the pre-pack, how do you see the creditors' interference or control on this process? Yes, Sapan.
I think that the process is fundamentally different from the CIRP, which is creditor in possession, and this is debtor in possession. So the role of the creditor is going to be basically limited in as far as the day-to-day running of the company is concerned. It will basically come down to agreeing some sort of protocols with the debtor during the moratorium of 90 days. That how is he going to run the operation? And given the complexity of each businesses, which are very specific, it can't be expected of lenders to know about each and every industry. So I think during over a period of time, the creditors will come up with some broad conditions around which a debtor will have to operate during those 3 months. Which simpler ones are debt to equity, which anyways he will not be allowed, but still maintaining inventory, hiring people, getting rid of people, government permissions, regularization, compliances. So they will basically come up with some sort of a checklist, which they will say that, look, you have to work within this framework during this 90 days so that the value of the enterprise is maintained. Because leakage would be one of the biggest concerns for them, and especially if a promoter who is hit by 29A, that you have entrusted someone who knows that he's not going to buy it, and then everyone will have an emotional and financial affinity to the industry which they have built. So I think the primary role of the lenders will become to ensure that the value is not eroded while it is in debtor's control, and it remains a going concern, which was primarily an RP's role. Here it is RP which is not doing it. So I think creditors over a period of time will come up with their own set of guidelines, which will say, okay, let's frame this, agree with the debtor, and say this is how you are going to operate, and anything outside this will require our consent. And I think now it was a concern 4 years ago because all of us were new to the process as lawyers, as RPs, and as banks. Now bankers have learned a lot with being part as COCs, so there's enough experience sitting with them to arrive at what needs to be done. So I think it will become a self-regulated process where creditor will reach an agreement with the debtor.
Okay, so Sapan, basically you mean to say that the CD will be a disciplined entity who would follow the regulations that are being dictated by the creditors on them, and then the system will work, where RP will only follow the process without interfering into the working of the company. So in your view, does this data in possession in pre-pack would be effective? When we are looking at CRP, even with the creditors in possession, we have seen and we have found most of the time really challenging situation coming in. So in this pre-pack, how this data in possession would be effective? Can you throw some light?
Yes, so I think that's where the 29A becomes very important. And we have to look at 29A not from the perspective of making these people ineligible. That is one part of it. The other part of it is that once you make the person ineligible, he has no skin in the game, other than the regulatory requirements that he doesn't want to commit anything wrong legally, but financially he doesn't have a skin in the game. So I think where will pre-pack go? Where will it work the best? That this is within 1 year, the 29A disadvantage is not there with the promoter. And promoter actually brings in some private equity investor or some strategic investor to say that, look, this is the proposal I have. Like Mr. Pandey was saying that why it is better than the OTS. So there it will go and fill the situation where OTS is not working out because there's a lack of trust with the banks and the promoter. The investor is saying, look, I don't know how long this process will continue. I am here for 2 years. It has not worked. Are you bankers willing to talk? And bankers say, are the promoters willing to talk? This is basically bringing people on one platform, and it will work the best when promoter is probably going to stay, and there is equity available to him from some other investor, which takes the lenders out, and then the three parties reach a conclusion in a given frame of time. So as CIRP worked for certain industry, for certain companies over a period of time, pre-package will also find its niche that where it suits or serves the best. And then that's why there's a second solution. We are not saying that one solution is sufficient. CIRP played its role, liquidation played its role. So now pre-package will play its role. So it will be, I think, even if you look at the report, it discusses that whether stress is enough. It says no, because stress can be misused. So let's have NPA, or let's have some SMA, so that there is an actual default. So there is an actual default. Promoter will come in, walk into the bank and say, look, I am not able to manage. I have so-and-so investor who's willing to come. Are you willing to take it into pre-package? I'll bring him, you get your money, or we restructure, or whatever we do, and allow me to float. And I think that's where this remedy will come. And we all look at IBC numbers, but the biggest impact of IBC was outside IBC, on the promoters and all, that they walked into the banks, and we had this beautiful number of 80,000 crores flowing once, that, okay, this much has been settled because of IBC. So it's like not just is done, but seem to be done, sort of a concept. So pre-package will really fit into that lane, that allowing banks under a valid process with 51% vote to really continue with that scenario.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to comment here. I like
Yes,
to
sir.
add to what Swapnil said. So basically, I see that pre-pack will take off only in those cases where there is a good level of confidence between the borrower and the lenders. Unless there is because why CRP has taken off in a big way is because we know that there is an outside independent person taking control of the company. So we can depend on it, whatever he says. On the other side, that has created problems, like the promoters have removed the books of account, they have not given access to the, so many issues are there, litigation and all that, so that is taken care of. So that is one part. And secondly, I think this process will also lead to some kind of new avenue, like some companies, as Swapnil said, like your real estate, the EPC contractors, the construction, infrastructure. These kind of companies have totally failed. The CRP has failed to take them to resolution. There, I think this pre-pack will be of good use, because they are basically the promoter-driven businesses. Unless you bring in the promoter and provide some kind of resolution, so I think pre-pack will work better for these kind of businesses.
Okay.
So that is what I would say. Thank you.
Right. Sir, when you said about this, the pre-packs in India and the pre-packs outside India, which are there, my understanding is that there is a difference between both the things. What we have done in the discussion paper of pre-packs in India, we have tried to tweak the CRP into pre-CRP period, as we discussed, and come out with a solution of a pre-pack. So it's a pre-pack, as I understand, is basically a mixture of a OTS and the CRP to come out with a conclusion with a predefined solution, so that it gets resolved, right? So can you throw a light on what globally? Yes, sir.
So should I respond?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can take, and Sapan can join you, because both of you can give some light on this
No, I-
global part of pre-pack, sir.
Yeah. No, I think globally it is a very well-established regime. And one, because whenever you go to insolvency, you go with a base plan. So that takes care of the CRP risk. CRP, the major risk is of liquidation. When you are going to CRP, I'm sure that 4 out of 5 times I land into a liquidation and I lose substantial value, which may go below the 10% of the value of the company. So here you are going with a plan. That is one good thing. Second thing, the promoters are in control. Internationally, the maximum number of successful resolutions are through the existing promoters or with the cooperation of existing promoters. That is the baseline. Whereas the 29A has kind of distorted that structure in India. That has led to like a lot of companies going into liquidation because of 29A. That is my personal view. So, of course, we have our some legacy for this, but otherwise 29A has actually distorted the basic structure of the code, which said that anybody can go to the NCLT and anybody can submit a plan. So that is there. So that is one part. So I think, as Mr. Supan also said, 29A should be slightly diluted to make this effective mechanism.
Yes. Sapan.
I think that's it. So, yeah.
Yes,
What
sir.
was the
Yes.
second part of your question?
Yeah, sorry. Sir, that was
What
the
was the
difference what I
second
was
part?
asking. Yes.
But it's basically the season of Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I think we should do what suits us, and we will find our own way. Yes, it's also always good to learn from the experiences of other jurisdictions, especially in jurisprudence. But I think the way Indian IBC came, it really was modeled on UK, and then we had some parts coming from US as well, but primarily it was modeled on UK. But it found its own way as we went ahead, because we said OC's decision can be decided by COC, so we came down to the commercial wisdom of COC, which was probably not the UK way of looking at things. So I think we will evolve it, and we should allow it to be evolved. The whole taboo which we have generally, that you are bankrupt, you are insolvent, and then we had an American president who did 2 bankruptcies and became US president. So as we evolve, there will be times when we have to appreciate and understand that not being able to pay the debt is part of a business cycle. Unfortunately, we had too many instances in the last few years where the default was not due to only business cycles. It was due to mismanagement, to put it mildly. And we got over it in the last 4 or 5 years. We hope that the governance standards, the lending practices, the borrowing practices all have improved and will improve. And pre-packaging, insolvencies, bankruptcies are part of cycles where everyone has to go through. And if you're done in the right spirit, it will be taken as one business cycle and not being that, oh, you didn't pay the bank, so I will not lend you again. So it's part of that growing up, which our system will go through. And I think then we will be better placed to compare ourselves with the Western economies. Right now, we are using them for ideas, legal experiences and jurisprudence. But commercially, we are yet not using them because we have yet not reached that evolved stage. So let's see how that progresses. But yeah, it's a good starting point. It took us 4.5 years to reach to pre-pack only. Let's see how it goes. Yeah.
Okay. Avil, this is for you basically. How effective would be Swiss challenge in passing of resolution plan in your view? Because here the promoter will be given an option under Swiss challenge to better the plan, and that 5% band what Sapan also explained. What is your view? How effective this Swiss challenge will, or how this Swiss challenge role will help in getting the resolution through?
So, I mean, essentially, every process is for value maximization. Either it is inter se bidding or bidding amongst the bilateral bidding or a Swiss challenge. So, ultimately, the outcome would be value maximization. But yes, defining a process would help the lenders also, because the trigger here is not the outcome, it's the initiation. So, in my view, initiation, it would be a big stumbling block. The informal process, which was start before the initiation of the process, the bilateral negotiations between the FCs and the promoter in terms of the base plan. Because unless the base plan is agreed, you cannot move ahead. So once the base plan is agreed, I think that's where the threshold for the lenders to expect some value over there. Then the process starts. And of course, as a natural progression, Swiss challenge is going to ensure that yes, the process was not one-sided. There was an opportunity which was given to a market participant, and the outcome is there. The reason I'm saying that it should be put in the plan just to avoid litigation, right? One or the other method of value maximization should be incorporated, and just to see how the market reacts.
Okay. I will taking the same discussion further. Now, when you are talking of a pre-pack, we discussed that in pre-pack with a 75% voting of unrelated creditors, it can be directed to liquidation. Now, is it fair to directly go into liquidation, or do you think the failure of pre-pack instead of taking to liquidation should be run through a CRP and then it will be taken into liquidation?
So the report, as the way it is framed right now, does not talk about an automatic liquidation in case of failure of a pre-pack. if the pre-pack fails, if there is no resolution at the end of the day, if the resolution plan or the base plan of the promoter is not accepted for whatever reason, or even after a Swiss challenge, the COC may not, in its commercial wisdom, reject the plan. So it will automatically not go towards initiation of a CIRP nor into a liquidation. During the 90-day process, the lenders may decide to liquidate the company at any point of time. So in that case, the threshold in terms of the bar has been set higher, 75% voting share. But in my view, the way I've read the report, it is not automatic liquidation. The process can fail. Thereafter, any creditor can take it to a CRP process and the CRP can start. So it is not, neither is liquidation automatic, nor is a commencement of a CRP automatic on failure of the process.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on this point. What I meant to say was that with 75% voting in 90 days, the creditors can take it, can say that the pre-pack has failed and then liquidation to be done of the company.
Right.
It does not say that the CRP to be initiated. So the right is given to the creditor to directly move the company to liquidation instead of CRP. So is that not a lose of right on the CD at that point of time to try and revive the company, or what do you think why this point would have been taken directly to liquidation? There is nothing automatic, I understand very well.
Right. So basically, I think in my view, the committee would have deliberated in terms of the maximization and reorganization. So in case the reorganization is not possible after having run a process, because once you run a process with a base plan in place and you are not looking at values, I mean, the commercial wisdom may probably direct the COC also to take it to liquidation. But yes, having said that, I mean, it would be highly litigated. I mean, it's open to judicial scrutiny also. So, I mean, there are pros and cons as far as that is concerned. But I think that's an option which has been given. Whether the COC members would opt for it, I mean, time would tell that.
Yes.
I think, Snehal, I'll add here that this is, the whole IBC scheme was based on the premises that a chance would be given for the asset to be revived for the various reasons. Mr. Pandey also mentioned job saving was one of the major things. And it's very, very difficult to create all these capex assets to keep the company running. And initially, a lot of decisions came which said that we will not allow the company to go into liquidation, so accommodate the plans, and court gave a lot of waivers. Now, what you're pointing out is very specific, and on the plain reading is this is probably correct, that you basically skip the whole CIRP. You go into there and on 85th day, sorry, nothing is working out, let's take it into the liquidation. Obviously, they will have to provide the whole procedure that how do you take it into the liquidation. You file it and you appoint a liquidator and things like that. But I think that probably would be a little draconian to really say that, okay, 90 days, because the problem with the 90 days is that 90 days is also too small a period. There may be investors and people who are willing to buy it, but they need to carry out a proper diligence, reach certain conclusions, and then make a proper plan and get into it. So they may not have enough time. But when it comes to CIRP, they may be in a better position to make some more offers. So to send directly a company into liquidation at 75% vote is probably against the scheme of the IBC, of the original IBC. Let me just call it that way. Is it the basic structure of the IBC which is getting tinkered with? Let's see. Yeah.
Right. That's the key point. Okay. One small, another point on now we have talked on a lot of things on the CD aspect and the pre-pack aspect. Now, our own fraternity, RP fraternity, who has been always on the taking side. Now here in this pre-pack also, the role has been defined to run the process, not to interfere in the company. So how far the role of a RP in the discussion paper you think is effective, and is there any suggestions on the role of a RP either to increase or decrease the scope of work that you have in mind? This is open to all the three panelists on this point.
I'll
So
request Avil because he has to do it. So he would.
yeah, I will.
So I mean, the way the scheme has been formulated, I mean, the role of the RP is very limited, and in my own experience, rightly so, because he may not have much to do in the process once that a base plan has been agreed before initiation of the process. So I mean, Miya Vivi Razi to kya karega Kazi? I mean, you can actually put it that way. So unless the FCs are convinced of a base plan, a base case scenario of getting a resolution, they are never going to approve the initiation of a pre-pack. So the role of the RP is limited, especially when it is a debtor in possession. So of course, I mean, I think the basic process would at the end of the day rest with the RP because avoidance application, valuation, I mean, all these are too much things to do in the 90-day process. So I would be happy if the load of the RP is reduced. And he looks at more from a process perspective. And of course, I think some of the hygiene aspects have already been taken care of in terms of the actions which the corporate debtor can take in terms of section 28 of the code, where a COC approval is required.
Yeah, well, apart from that, one more information memorandum also has been put on RP. So the information memorandum data to be provided by CD and RP has to review it. And in case of data default, wrong data being provided, the criminal action against the has been envisaged in the discussion paper. So here RP role, when it seems to be more of a facilitator where he has to just run through the process. But over a period when this responsibility of valuation, which is always a subject matter, very subjective in thing, where no predefined structures are there on the valuation aspect, where valuers are not guided properly, even in CRP and in liquidation, which we have been finding it difficult to understand on this valuation aspect. In pre-pack, again, this role being put on the RP, I think it would be challenging on the RP to look into this. And as far as accountability of the RP, maybe on the process, what you say is that any point from Sanjeev sir on this, because you always look from the other side for the RP, so
I
you
would
can
like
give
to
your
add,
better view of the RPs on this point.
coming back to my point, earlier point, that the entire process will depend on the confidence of the creditors, the lenders, on the promoters and the company. Because this is a debtor in control process, it is all the more important. And that confidence will come only from the recommendation of RP. That is why he is the independent person in between. He is the go person between the company and the banks. So if he indicates some hanky-panky in the scheme, immediately the creditors will back off. So I would like to add only two things. One, that I think some provision should be made in the law so that IP is empowered to extract the information, whatever he requires from the company. So something like 19A or 19, no, section 19 in the IBC, where the RP has the right to demand information. Something like that should be there. The second thing, bankers, even before getting into pre-pack, they would like to go through some kind of forensic audit of the company. So that is my sense. Ultimately, practically, when we go for this, so they will only have a confidence in the company once they go through some kind of forensics and are sure that has been no erosion is there, and company has not been deliberately made insolvent rather than a business insolvency. So RP's role is very big. Unless he gives confidence to the lenders, the process will move further. Yeah.
So RP role is still in the same way where what is there as in the CRP and in liquidation, where everyone will be just waiting to bounce on him on the various perspective look from the various angle by them. Okay, good. This with pre-packs, I think we have tried to give a good insight and got a good insight and the recommendations that we can make to the regulator on this pre-pack. Today we also have a discussion something like on liquidation, because in liquidation also there are a lot of gray areas still unanswered. So I would like to take up some questions on liquidation, where we come out with some solution, or we come give the RPs a guidance on it. Like Sanjeev sir, for you, how far liquidation plan submitted with the application, which is now the part of the liquidation application when it is to be filed, a liquidation plan has to be attached with that thing. Now, in that, basically the liquidation cost and the CRP cost funding, how it will be done, is the key aspect of that plan, which is mentioned. And normally, of late, we have seen that as and when required, it will be funded, is what the application states many a time. Okay, now what happens if it is not paid over a period? What will be the position, and how do be it looked into over a period? Because if the fund does not come even in liquidation stage at a proper time, it will be a very difficult challenge, and it will be a very challenging position for a liquidator to run the liquidation process. So, what is your view on this?
Well, I think now the regulations are very clear that the COC has to provide for liquidation funding at the time of even recommending a plan as well as recommending a liquidation. Only issue is that some of the COC may not be so aware or so enlightened. So they are just recommending liquidation without such provision. But then there is a counter provision which says that the liquidator can approach the NCLT and demand this money, which is now, as per law, the bankers or the COC has to provide. So I think it's a better idea that COC itself takes the onus, provide the money. We have seen in some cases where we failed to provide this kind of funds, and ultimately the RP or the liquidator came back with a big demand list, something like liquidation cost of 30 crores in one case. So that is the negative point. So I think that it is better for COCs to provide this funding and take up, do a proper accounting, like whatever the liquid assets in the company available, and reducing that from the liquidation cost. So that is doable. I think not a big deal, and it is in the favor of the bankers to provide this money. Unless then the ball will be in the IP's court, who can demand much higher amount than what is required.
Okay. Sapan, this one is for you. In case of pari passu charge on the asset amongst the financial creditors, what if certain creditors relinquish their right to the liquidator and certain are not in ready to relinquish that right to the liquidator? How liquidator you feel that should deal in such scenario?
I think the whole liquidation process, the way it was envisaged, that if company goes into liquidation, creditor had no role. I'm rewinding it to say 2.5, 3 years. Now then came the concept of consultative. Then you said make the committee and talk to them. So I think all of that spoiled the whole liquidation process. Creditors had a role to play. If they were given proper seat, then it was much easier. On pari passu, I think as long as the valuation is through the mode prescribed, through the notices and all of it, and it is not to a connected or a related party. So if all those things are taken care of, I don't think it should be left to the lenders on pari passu to really make the decision. Liquidator should go ahead and then sell it and put it in the TRA or the accounts which they maintain, and he should have proper notice given to the creditors. He should follow the proper process. But waiting really takes it back to the pre-CIRP. Then there was disagreement among the lenders, and that's why there was a delay. And now the value realization is also making it not happen. So the role, I think liquidator has powers, and he should go ahead as long as he can show that he has followed the process in a transparent manner, and he has taken all possible steps to arrive at the maximum value, and it should be implemented.
Okay. So taking from here one more point, which is always a concern, Section 230 in liquidation, with liquidation as a going concern. So do you think that even after the failure of restructuring CRP, the CD to be given this 230 and liquidation as a going concern to continue, or a straight sale has to happen? Because first you 30 days for 230, Section 230, trying to revive the company, you a liquidation as a going concern opportunity, and then go for sale. Is it not stretching beyond too far the realization of the assets value on this part?
Look, this was a very strict reading as it started, and IPC was extremely weak as a legislation in terms of defining the liquidation process, and then the guidelines came. It tried to clarify a bit. Then it also allowed selling of part assets, like you asked about pari passu. Earlier it was only the whole unit. Now liquidation as a going concern has to be really debated. What does it mean? Does it mean that the RP or the liquidator has to keep it as a going concern till the time it sells to preserve the value? In CIRP, the test is that it should remain a going concern even after selling. And feasibility, viability has to be stamped, has to be approved by COC, and by a resolution applicant has to give an undertaking that he will keep it as a going concern. In liquidation, there is no such requirement. It doesn't say it has to be feasible and viable. So I think lawyers will have to get into the thread bearing of that. Does it mean going concern at the point of selling or going concern after selling? And what percentage of going concern? Is it like, what are we saying? That just going concern to pay the salaries because there are no debtors, and to pay liquidators fees, good enough. So I think it needs a real bit of getting into the court. Some senior lawyers fighting it in the Supreme Court and getting a clarification done. But principally, if you ask me, my view would be, in liquidation you have to sell whatever is the best way. You just don't really say going concern, this asset can't be sold. The only principle has to be followed is that you don't sell like an engine first and then say I'll sell body later, because body is going to be scrapped. So you will have to take those commercial decisions that by selling X, the Y becomes useless. So you have to sell X and Y together so that you get value of Y. I think that sort of decision needs to be taken by liquidator and consultative committee, that don't strip the company in a way that it just remains a bare shell and there is no buyer for the company. As long as you take care of that issue, I think it's too much to ask that it has to be a going concern from a liquidator perspective.
Yes.
I would like to add here that basically the basic design of the code, the CIRP is the process for resolution. And the resolution as a going concern, no sale as a going concern, not the liquidation. So liquidation is basically a process where to sell the assets. So what the courts are trying to do is that they're flogging a dead horse. So they are trying to, section 230, trying to sell as a going concern. So I think the liquidation process itself is not designed for sale as a going concern, because the moment you sell as a going concern, then you have to complete the liquidation process, which goes to the section 54. Company has to go into dissolution. So how can you dissolve a company which is going concern? So then you have to sell the business as a going concern, not the company as a going concern. So that is one aspect of it. And if there is a possibility of resolution, why not seek extension, get a resolution during CIRP? Why you want a resolution under liquidation, which is a process for sale of assets? So I think law is very clear. Only some of the people are trying to confuse the courts, and I think some zeal for saving jobs and all those things, that has created this kind of anomalies. Otherwise, this section 230 should not be there. We have seen one case, Gujarat NRE, it is running as a going concern for last 2 years. The value is lost every month. 3 to 4 crores are paid to the workers and employees. That is the value lost for the creditors. Ultimately, I don't think this will work. Let's hope, as Mr. Sobhan said, the lawyers have to fight it out in the court. But my view is that the code is designed as CIRP for resolution and liquidation for sale.
Yeah, Gujarat NRE is surprising. One of the earliest cases, and there was a recovery, and then this whole legal thing was taken care of. The other way to look at it is that can liquidation process be made something similar to SARFAESI process? That you go out, you sit down, and you say you will sell in parts or you will sell in full. You make that decision, invite the auction, get the price, and out. This whole process of whether the right price, wrong price, lenders agree, don't agree. You tried in CIRP, it didn't work out. You tried before CIRP, it didn't work out. Now you are in liquidation. Just by waiting, there is no one going to come from heavens and going to pay you 10 times of the asset. So this is what you are going to get. 29A is getting applicable to liquidation. So your transparency on all is taken care of. So you auction whosoever you get as the best You sell and be out. And also this whole provision of saying 2 years is allowed. Fees is higher when you say do it early. You know, all of this is not helping. You have to just simply say for SARFAESI, this is doing fine. Especially in mortgaged assets, and a lot of these assets have a fixed security. So just do it. Like in some companies, even trademarks have a value. So I think the process needs to be much more simplified.
I think to add to this, I mean, the idea of a going concern is essentially to sell the assets in a slump sale. In some of the cases, the licenses are with the company, and in many of the cases, some licenses are attached to the asset. So it would then depend with the trade-off. So it's an added I would say, a tool to the liquidator to decide on a process whether a slump sale would derive more value or the market participants are looking at the company as a going concern, having the brand, the values, etc., and the licenses attached to it. Just to give you an example, now, in case there is a lease where the lease were to revert back, so the land is not the ownership of the corporate debtor, it is the leasehold right. In the event of a liquidation, if the leasehold right was to go out, the value of the land would be zero. So in that case, even a slump sale may fail. So it would be better for me to sell the company as a going concern. Of course, as Sanjeev sir rightly put it, section 54, there is also an NCLT order which says in liquidation, you have to just dissolve the company. It can't go as a going concern. But I mean, to maximize the value, yes, I mean, one size does not fit all in a liquidation process. Second point is in the case of an EPC or an infrastructure companies where the projects are running. So, I mean, you can sell some business as a going concern. There are a lot of live bank guarantees which are there, which also is a recovery to the lenders on a protection of these particular bank guarantees. So in a liquidation, I mean, if it is a manufacturing setup, you can do it as a slump sale. If it is an infrastructure project, you will have to look at it differently. If it is a hotel or so, different assets will have to be looked at differently. Now, if a solar project goes into liquidation, you'll have to sell the company because the PPA is attached to the company and not to the asset. So in my view, I mean, it's an additional tool to the liquidator, and as Sapan rightly put out, value maximization is what the liquidator has to see, whether X will fetch you better value, X plus Y will fetch you better value. So that's a call which the liquidator will have to take.
Yes, Avil, one question for you basically on this. Basically, when the liquidation order is pronounced, the financial creditor the secured creditor, not financial, the secured creditor has to within 30 days give their consent, either relinquish or they are taking the asset outside the liquidation. And now even in the claim form, they have made that provision, what I understand, that they have to write whether they are relinquishing that right or not is a part of the claim form also they have made it. Right now, for example, in a case where they are not relinquishing that right to the liquidator and taking asset outside the liquidation, further it has been said that within 90 days, they have to sell, and if it is not sold, it will come back to the liquidation estate, right, to the that asset. So practically, how does it work? Because if the secure creditor is to take it out of the liquidation and they want to sell it, they would be selling it under SARFAESI, more probably. Now, SARFAESI within 90 days sale to happen is also going to be another challenge. So obviously, after 90 days, if the sale does not happen, it comes back to the liquidator as a liquidation estate. So what is your practical experience or view on this thing?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, two questions arise. One is the decision of the lenders, whether to exercise their option under section 52 and stand out of liquidation, or the decision of the lenders to fall in line and be a part of the liquidation estate and allow the liquidator to sell the asset. I had 2 points on this. One is, as far as relinquishment is concerned, the law now very clearly says 30 days. So within 30 days, the secured creditors at the time of submission of a claim will have to take that call. Suppose in a particular asset, it is a pari passu charged asset with 5 lenders and 4 relinquish, and the 5th lender does not relinquish it in favor of the liquidation estate. What does the liquidator do? So as you rightly put it, I mean, the lenders would sell it under a SARFAESI, and in SARFAESI, the 60% by value in terms of threshold, the blocking right applies. So if this fifth creditor has 20%, he can't do anything. So the liquidator has 80% in that case. He can well go ahead and exercise his option to sell the asset. So the liquidator, the moment the threshold of relinquishment passes 60%, I mean, the asset automatically falls into the liquidation estate and the liquidator can deal with it. So that's one aspect as far as relinquishment is concerned. The second aspect is, I mean, although the regulation does say that within 90 days, any asset which stands out will have to be sold. Of course, it is even difficult for a liquidator to achieve that. So if the lenders have to do it, good luck. But I think the criteria which talks about they giving the insolvency resolution process cost and the liquidation cost towards that particular asset of 90 days. I'm not sure in how many of the assets this would happen, because they'll not put good money after bad money. So most of the lenders are going to resist this. I have not faced it in my case as of now, because wherever I am the liquidator, I mean, I am selling the assets as a part of the process.
Okay. Sanjeev, anything from your side on this point?
Yeah,
Before we take the audience question.
This is one challenge I think in many cases we are facing, that some banks are relinquishing and some are not pari passu assets. So I think Mr. Avil has rightly clarified. But the problem will come where the 40% relinquish and 60% do not relinquish. Then you have a problem at it, and many cases are like that. I think there is a need for some added regulation in this regard, that wherever maybe more than 30% or 40% relinquish, then the entire asset should be relinquished, otherwise should stay out. So some regulation is required here. Otherwise, this problem won't go like that.
Okay. So it seems it's still unresolved, and we need to come out with some regulation, the regulator to come out with the regulation on it. Okay, so now we take some questions that has been posted by the participants one by one, and take it. One is by Jinal Sanghvi. Would the exemption, the regulatory or statutory, that a company enjoys under CRP process be available under pre-pack process unless it acquires court approval? If no, how one would deal with it? Yes. Yes, sir. Anyone? Any of the panelists would like to take this question?
I think it should continue. I think I understand the question. I'm just reading it. I think I understand the question to basically say that all the omissions which are available under CIRP will be available under pre-pack. I think the answer will be yes, that all the protection will continue. Otherwise, pre-pack under IBC has no meaning.
Yes, so the basic structure of the code has been maintained. So a resolution applicant, the successful resolution applicant will get all the exemptions which are available. So the binding nature of a resolution plan and in a CIRP, the committee has recommended would also stay in a pre-pack regime.
Right. Another question is from Hemant Shah. In case of CD, the pre-pack plan approved, what is the impact on personal guarantor to the extent of haircut to FC?
I doubt it will. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir.
I feel that the pre-pack plan will take care of the guarantor's liability also. So when they discuss with the bank, so they'll have to put in some money in respect of guarantees also. And second aspect is that the guarantees will continue. Unlike a CRP, if the plan is approved with the existing promoter, so I think guarantees and other kind of collaterals will continue even after the plan is approved.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I think this question has been asked by Hemant Bhai. I think the guarantee remained, is an elusive thing in IBC. The guarantee guidelines did not come. DRT guidelines are there. DRT has still not formed the process. Then we had the matter which is pending in Supreme Court of about guarantee being there or not. Some plans contained extinguishment of guarantee. Most of them did not. Lenders wanted to keep it in some cases. The RA wanted to keep it in some cases. So it's unfortunately an area that we don't have much success as far as the defaulting promoters are concerned. Supreme Court has mentioned about this, Ministry of Finance have mentioned about this, but no concrete steps have been taken. So we have to see a lot of personal insolvencies which need to happen for the gap, the haircut word which you have used for the amounts which has not been recovered by the bank. But a lot needs to be done. And to answer your question precisely, yes, I think it should be the same treatment as it was in CIRP.
Okay. Next question, I think we have already answered that during our session, but I will just read out. If RP is to run process and management integrity is not assured, should RP should not have some control in management activities to help the retained value? I think that has been answered during our session, that without the trust and without the factor with the base plan, prepacks cannot go ahead. So if the party is without integrity, probable to move ahead on this thing may be difficult. Any other view on this answer, basically? Anyone?
Yeah, I think that is the answer. Even like you have rightly compared it with the OTS. So even in
Right.
OTS, we see that the banks initially go for a forensic to find out the true
Right.
story behind the insolvency, and then only OTS. So here also we feel that some kind of forensic audit will be done before accepting this kind of. So RP has to be kept into confidence by both the company and the bank. Unless RP recommends a plan, I think this process will not go through.
Right. Next is from Prakash Mishra ji. A financial stressed CD is already having a strained relationship with the creditors. So the role of RP will be to convince creditors prior to initiation of the process. How he can be expected to have an independent of CD? He has to be independent of CD if he has to move on this, I think. Yes.
No, he cannot be independent of CD. See, my view is that initially the RP will be engaged by the CD. But
Right.
by nature of his job, IT is an independent person. So he has to maintain that independence. Even if he is engaged by the CD at an early stage, even before default, and he will do all the due diligence and come back to the creditors with a plan. But we expect the RP will maintain that independence and work in the interest of both the CD as well as the creditors.
Right. So RP is an independent person itself. He cannot get biased either to CD or a creditor. Even in CRP also it is the same, but still the banks have not been taking that in that manner. OC cases filed, the COC normally changes, thinking that he may be biased towards the other party. But same thing I think is here. So we go ahead on the next question.
One thing I would add here is, Sunilji, that one conflict of interest is that fees of the RP is being paid by CD here. So that is where the CD can kind of manipulate the RP. So if the process can be modified so that the RP fees, just like the provision for liquidation cost in a liquidation. So here also, when the plan comes to the bank, there should be a provision for the CRP cost or the prepack cost. That should be upfront made in a escrow account with the bank, so that RP is not running around the CD for his fees and other costs. That should be provided upfront.
Okay. There's a good suggestion. RP will always welcome this suggestion, sir. Next point is from Jigar Shah. In a real estate liquidation or sale of business as a going concern, say it has 5 different projects, which each project be treated as a separate business. So I think that also already Sapan took it in that it can be done in many manner, and I will also explain that. So any different view, it can be sold as 5 different projects, what Jigar is asking. So I think it can be sold at 5 different projects also. Nothing I don't think any issue in it. Anyone having any different view from the panel?
No.
I think this should be allowed.
Okay. The next question is from Ashok Ramaniji. What happens to the concession or waivers of operational creditors statutory dues generally sought after in resolution plan under CRP?
I think the plan will have to provide for them. The treatment will have to be given to them. And when the
Right.
WAS is there, it will have to be provided. I don't think the plan will look very much different from the CIRP plans.
Right.
There will not be a 53 waterfall here. It will be like reverse of 53. When these unsecured creditors will be get paid first, and whatever remains in the waterfall will pass on to the financial creditors. That is the plan.
Okay. I think most of the questions we have answered of the thing. And I think Priya madam is also there as one of the participants. And we had an interaction on this pre-discussion at our IPA also. If Sri Priya madam can unmute herself and just the points that we have discussed, any other points that we have on pre-pack she can also share the things to this forum.
Thanks, Snehalji, and it's been a very, very nice program and phenomenal learning. I just thought we'll talk about just three things which I'm a little confused about. One is obviously this entire pre-pack came because of a need for speed, which is what the BLRC spoke about. But I'm a bit skeptical with our NCLT delays on whether that speed can be maintained, especially because they again have a very small threshold, which is 1 lakh to 1 crore and the COVID cases. However, I think both the promoters and the shareholders having to agree and the financial creditors having to agree might restrict the number of applications. So maybe IBBI should actually look at more, sort of novel processes to see if there can be some green channels, virtual hearings, etc., and get NCLT to do something like that for very small value cases. So that's one thing, because currently I don't think we are able to get very quick justice in NCLTs. Several resolution plans are pending. So that's the first challenge. The second thing is the role of the RP. And as we discussed, I think it's extremely complex. This is a this is a debtor in possession model. So again, we spoke about this, the whole code and its presumption is a creditor in control, and how this carve out they're going to do will be very interesting, because it's completely changes it for a certain class of people and for a class of applicants rather. So what we discussed was that the RP's rule should be severely restricted in this case. And the usual blanket saying you'll have to handle all compliances, everything is going to be very difficult. It has to be very simple. It has to be restricted to I will receive the IM, do a very high level review, update the IM for later situations, 2, issue a Form G, 2, call for claims, collect claims, determine on a best effort basis, 3, issue Form G, 4, do the Swiss challenge RFRPs, place them. That's all somebody can do. In fact, I don't quite agree with this moratorium with debtor in possession and how much of the responsibility would devolve on the RP. We need to be very careful. That's part 2, and we'll have to sort of come up very strongly to restrict our rules in this process. The third thing that I'm very concerned about is whether this process can mar the already existing rights of operational creditors, which are severely marred in any case. I don't know whether, given again a debtor in possession, a pre-pack arrangement, etc., and possibility of phoenixing, I'm not even getting into it now because it's too early to say, whether this pre-pack should provide for voting by classes of creditors. Are you just going to take only the financial creditors, put it through a voting plan, where you come back for a pre-packaged process? I think needs to be, sort of very, very seriously looked at, because the process can get gamed. Because elsewhere, I think in the world, classes of creditors do come in to vote. And this acquires greater significance because the Supreme Court has now held in, I think, Maharashtra seamless, that your resolution plan can be less than liquidation value. I think this is sort of, a court-blessed OTS, which sort of, not just an OTS which is between two parties, but a court-blessed OTS which virtually waves away rights of operational creditors. So these are the only 3 things that I thought, and of course this challenge on avoidance, etc., etc. I think the RP should not even be asked to do an avoidance review. I don't even want to take custody of books and records because it's just not going to work. We'll just see a surplus of section 19(2) equivalent applications. Better not to clog the tribunal. And if you decided to trust, we should just trust and hope that the Swiss challenge works and build in some safeguards on resolution plans lesser than liquidation value. Should they be accepted at all? I think that's a point. And since we're looking at a diametrically opposite model of debtor in possession, we must also look for operational creditor safeguards in this part of the. That's about it. These are a few of my submissions.
Thank you, Shripriya madam, on your views on this. I just took an opportunity because I saw you in the participant list.
Thank you so much.
And we had been debating this at our IPA also. So I thought to get all the participant advantage of this. That's why I took a liberty and asked you to speak on this topic.
Thanks so
Yes.
much.
Last question that we have on the chat box before we conclude is from Sanju Kumar, that during CRP, if it is found that there are no assets of the CD and promoters are absconding, whether process of liquidation will have to be still followed or it should move to dissolution on the process part. Yes, I think.
Yeah, so I'll answer that. So at the time of liquidation, there is also a provision for early dissolution, which says that the assets are insufficient even to meet the liquidation cost. The liquidator can file for a dissolution. So I think, yes, in case there are no assets of the CD, directly it heads to dissolution. In my view, you can do this.
Okay. So I think this covers. Yes.
One more question also by Shripriya madam, saying that I do not think that the regulation mandates any time limit in which a creditor who's standing outside needs to enforce. I agree with that. There is no binding on a creditor who's standing outside the process to sell within timelines. But within 90 days, at the end of 90 days, he has to deposit his share of the insolvency resolution process cost and the liquidation cost. And if it goes to 180 days, in case the value of the asset is more and his debt is less, so the excess over the claim amount will also have to be deposited as a part of the liquidation estate.
Okay. I think this is a good clarification that has been given. I think we have a good deliberation on our topic. All the three panelists have done their thing. I would request G. Chandrasekhar Ji, the Director IMC, ERFT, to kindly offer the vote of thanks to our panel speakers.
All right. Thank you, Snehal Bhai. My name is Chandrasekhar. I'm Economic Advisor to the IMC Chamber of Commerce. Let me confess, I'm a student of law, but let me confess I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, thoroughly enjoyed the panel discussion, various points that were brought out. Really fantastic insights into some of the nuances of this law. Very, very interesting. I have always believed that IBC, the processes must follow what I would now think, and I'm actually thinking on my feet, what they must follow PET principle, P-E-T. What is this PET principle? One is predictability. Second is equity. Third is transparency. Therefore, if at every stage we follow the PET principle, predictability, equity, and transparency, I'm sure this is going to be a fairly important and successful legislation that this country needs. Extremely important. And second one is finality. I think we should as someone mentioned, one of the speakers, that after the process is complete, if another agency, an investigative agency, starts to investigate, I think that would not bring finality, but this process of IBC process must eventually bring finality. Number one. Number two, I would also think this entire process should be technology driven. Particularly, it should be digitalized if it is not already digitalized, and therefore tech driven process would obviously advance transparency. There is no doubt at all. So having said all this, I want to thank, of course, Sanjeev Pandey, Avil Menezes, and Sapan Gupta for bringing out, for sharing their thoughts, in-depth knowledge and experience in this matter of pre-pack and liquidation under IBC. Thank you very much. I also want to, of course, thank our own Snehal Kamdar, who's the trustee of the IP Foundation, which has a formal relationship with the IMC Chamber of Commerce for organizing this. I found more than 60 participants had logged on, and I also want to thank all the participants for raising questions that which were very effectively answered by the panelists, and of course Sri Priya came up with some brilliant ideas, brilliant points. Thank you very much. With this, we will conclude this panel discussion. Very interesting. I'm sure there is a lot of take-home message in this. I also want to thank Anita Naik. Anita has actually coordinated all this, and she deserves, and all the panelists and speakers deserve a good round of applause. Let's applaud their efforts. And let me now conclude by saying good luck and God bless you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Snehal ji. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.